Graeme is going to talk about risk and resource in oil and gas. So this is where we can really learn from another sector. Yes, it is an extractive sector, but it's one that maybe has some learnings for us. So Graeme, over to your wonderful self.
Thanks, Sarah. So yes, so sort of talking a little bit oil and gas, trying to sort of explain a little bit some of the practices there. I'm going to talk about the Society of Petroleum Engineers Petroleum Resources Management System, it's called. And I'm actually going to present it a little bit more as it was intended, rather than as it actually sort of looks in practice today and how it's looked. I caught myself talking about this the other day. I talk about the oil industry in the past tense the whole time. And I have to stop doing that. Obviously, I've moved out of the oil industry now, but looking at the way the oil industry is taking a battering in this current crisis, I really have to get out of the habit of talking about it in the past tense. I have a bit of a unique insight on the SP guidelines because it's actually my father who put them together. So I made the mistake of asking him about it the other night to get some insight into what it was they had in mind when they put them together. And I don't know, about 3.5 hours later, he finally wrapped up and stopped talking about what it was supposed to look like, and then all the things that went horribly wrong along the way. This presentation follows really, really nicely on from Teresa's presentation earlier, and I'm really, really happy about that. It's very nice that, I think a lot of the elements that need to go into a system like that, Teresa talked about them, and those guidelines there have put it out, and you're going to see a lot of the same vocabulary in this as well. So without further ado, so I have 3 things I'm hoping you'll take away from this. One is that a probabilistic approach to reserves reporting, reserves and resources reporting, I should say. So also not just the sort of guaranteed proven stuff, but also the more speculative material. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty in this, and the only way to really get hold of that in a systematic way is to do it probabilistically. If you do it well, it's a thing of power, elegance, and beauty. If you don't do it well, it's really not. And that's a little bit the discussion I hope we might have afterwards. The key part, the essence of this probabilistic approach is a portfolio view. That's very important. Probabilistic approach allows you to have a portfolio view, but also the portfolio view is very important to have a good probabilistic approach, and I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. And the key link here, I think, to what we talked about, especially what Teresa was talking about this morning, is that all the uncertainties have to be taken into account. And this is really the sort of keyhole that the ESG issues can be put into. So issues like, is it at all possible to have a government framework that we can live with? And how do we risk essentially our resources to take account of that? If we're going to do this responsibly, environmentally responsibly, it's going to be more expensive. We need to put that in, and we need to be able to account for that in our economic thresholds, and that needs to be captured in the way that we report our reserves. So what this is a very high level helicopter view of a framework that allows you to do that in a very systematic way. Moving on. Okay, so let's have a little look at the uncertainties. Again, Teresa's already been through a lot of these, so I can whip through it very quickly. Obviously, we have subsurface, and I'm talking about oil and gas here, and I've made no effort to try and sort of pass it over to mining. So I'm just going to sort of talk about oil and gas, and I'll let the mining experts sort of make the mapping into the mining world. We have subsurface. We obviously, how big's the tank? How full is it? Does it leak? Reservoir quality is very important. 2 issues here: how much oil is there? But also, how quickly can we get it out of the ground? Does it flow by itself, or do we have to, frack it and pump it out? Enormous uncertainty. I mean, the ratio of a low side case to a high side case in the sort of early phase of oil and gas exploration can be as much as 40 or 50. I mean, it's absolutely enormous range of uncertainty here, and it's resolved incrementally as you go through the life cycle of resources. So you'll buy some acreage, you'll have a sense that maybe there's something there, but you drill a well. Now you do some seismic first and get a bit more of a view, maybe rule some things out, rule some things in. You drill a well, then you demonstrate that there is some resource there. You have a sense of the reservoir properties, maybe how thick it is, but you don't really know where it fills up to. And as you go on and you appraise and you do more and more, this uncertainty gets smaller and smaller. And you'll see that in a second. So subsurface uncertainty is the absolutely overwhelming uncertainty, obviously, in far as reserves are concerned. But the engineering comes into it as well, and that has a lot to do with economics. We'll get to oil price in a minute, but this is a question of what do you need to get the oil out of the ground? How much work do you need to do? You pumping water in? Are you doing gas lift? how much water is coming out with the oil, how many wells will you need is is a real key thing as far as the costs are concerned. And this is all going into setting a sort of economic threshold that says you need a certain resource, you need a certain amount of volume in order to be able to realize resources. It's one thing that they're there, but if you can't produce them economically, then they're not going to happen. So there's a lot of uncertainty that comes in through that. Having said that, the uncertainty is relatively small once you know about the subsurface. So once you know about reservoir property, you know about how well the reservoir is connected and so on, then it's, there's still some uncertainty. It's not absolutely sure, but it's a relative, compared to the basic uncertainty about subsurface, it's relatively small. And then we come into the sort of really interesting things apart from sort of what we call in oil and gas, at least, above surface considerations. And this is things like, license to operate. And that can be, does the government like you enough to give you a license to operate? But also, as a socially responsible company, is this somebody you want to operate? Is this somewhere you want to operate? Is this something you want to live with? It goes a little bit back to Nick's point about getting the customer-facing companies to take on a little bit of that social pressure. But then you also have to come to terms with the government. You have to be able to produce oil at a tax rate that you can make money out of it. You need to come to terms with other companies that you want to do these things with. Nearly all of these things are joint ventures with 3 or 4 companies involved. There's operating environment, local content will come into that in a big piece. Is this a government you want to work with from a social responsibility point of view? All of these things. Now, a lot of these things in a lot of places in the world, they're absolutely, foreordained and they're nothing to worry about. Either it's just a place you're never going to work, or it's a place that there's never been a problem and it's going to be fine. But there are a lot of places where this is a little bit, and you see this a lot, because the places where it's absolutely fine, they've been pretty much drained. The places where nobody wants to work, nobody wants to work. So what you're getting is this sort of hinterland between those two extremes. So what you'll get is things like, Iran was a big target country for a lot of companies recently. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether that was at all going to go. And there are other countries around the world where they're maybe a little bit more dubious in terms of some of these ESG, CSR issues. And then what you have in there in terms of the uncertainty is you have this uncertainty that you're ever going to get the conditions that you need as a corporately socially responsible company in order to be able to start producing those things. And that obviously goes into the way that these things are assessed. There tend to be on-off things. Either you just don't go there because you can't get it to work, or it's the subsurface and the engineering things, they affect the value. They're sort of continuous uncertainties. They affect the value, they affect the resource. Whereas these things tend to be, yes, we're going to do it, or no, we're not. But relatively speaking, as uncertainties go, they're usually fairly stable, except for these few exceptions. They're relatively predictable, and interestingly, they're controllable, much more so than subsurface and engineering. And then finally, the biggest uncertainty that we deal with in oil and gas is the price. And I just put the last 20 years of oil price there, which is actually quite an interesting snapshot of my life. You see those big dips there, just think, oh yeah, that was a hard one. And then last one, oh God, that was a hard one too. Luckily, I was kind of out by the last one where it went negative for a while. But it's an incredibly volatile market, and we spend an enormous amount of time trying to predict it, and nobody ever does it terribly well. So you always have that basic uncertainty there. As far as reserves are concerned, obviously reserves are not interested, or resources are not interested in what the oil price is. But in terms of can you produce them economically, it's obviously a major factor. So how do we sort of fold all of these things and have a framework where we can sort of capture them that also gives us this opportunity to capture these ESG CSR issues? And this is where the portfolio perspective comes in. So if we look at a single prospect, we have this sort of progression that I was talking about earlier. Buy some land, we'll do some seismic on the land, we maybe drill a well. On the basis of seismic, we say there's nothing here, or they're too small, the things are too small, we're never going to go for it. You drill a well, the well may fail, the well may succeed, but the reservoir not good enough. So all of these points, you're essentially gathering some information, reducing the uncertainty, and then making a decision on the basis of the reduced uncertainty. And at any point along the way, you can hop off and ditch this. And that's quite difficult from a resources point of view, because actually what you find is that, if you're tracking a single prospect through, most of them die before they get to production. So what you do is you fill up pipeline here. This is my pipeline in the middle. You fill up your pipeline with lots and lots of things. And then you have this sort of high grading churn mechanism where you gather information and you throw things out if it's not working for you and you keep it going. And as you go through, the number of things that you have in your pipeline is getting smaller and smaller. But at the same time, A, they should be getting better and better, and B, the uncertainty is reducing. Now, what happens is at a new ventures level where you're just sort of buying land, the stuff that's much more speculative, large number, very low probability it's going to work, because you've got all the geological things that you have to de-risk. You have all of the commercial, political, CSR issues that you will have to de-risk as well. So, relatively low chance that it'll work, but obviously you wouldn't be looking at it if it wasn't going to pay for itself when it does work. So you have this sort of high risk, high return portfolio with a long upside tail. You get a little bit of reduction as you sort of go in and start drilling and start doing seismic, but not huge much. The big reductions come when you get agreements, commercial agreements in place. That removes all of those uncertainties. And also when you start discovering things. Obviously, when you start discovering things, that reduces the variance enormously, both in terms of whether or not you're going to discover things, but also in terms of understanding what it is that you have there. And then finally, in the last stage, actually the reduction of uncertainty, once you've got it up and running, you've got if you've enough of a commercial agreement in place to be drilling exploration wells and putting development projects together, then the fact that when it's up and running and producing, you're not actually that much wiser, relatively speaking, at the end of that session. I'll come back to the blue and red lines in a second. The way the SPE tried to capture this, what you have is essentially you have a sort of time dimension here as things become de-risked, and it's actually the portfolio that's being de-risked rather than you can't. I mean, you can talk about something being de-risked in the sense that you've thrown it out, then there's no uncertainty anymore, or you've thrown it out. But it's really the portfolio de-risking. You're reducing the uncertainty on the portfolio, and that's a very important distinction. What the SPE tried to do was to sort of capture that and say, okay, we recognize that we have this large range of uncertainty, and even when we're producing, we still have a large range of uncertainty about what we're going to be able to produce. So we'll have that in the mechanism. So what they did is they have the prospective resources, and then they have these low estimate, best estimate, high estimates. Now, originally, these were percentiles of that uncertainty distribution. And that was the way it's supposed to be. So this was the 10th percentile, or as the oil and gas business call it, the 90th percentile. It's a bit strange. This should be the 50th and this should be the 10th. And really the difference between the prospective resources and contingent resources is that the uncertainty should reduce. And at the same time, there's a sort of parallel tracking of the increased likelihood of commerciality as you go through here. And this is essentially just trying to sort of capture this model here where you have the uncertainties that's coming through, and I'll explain a little bit how that works in a second. The reality and how it is actually interpreted and how people used it was actually not quite like that, but this was the basic idea. Now, what's going on here is as you go through these things and you're throwing things out, you're doing two things. You're high grading and you're reducing the uncertainty. Now, all other things being equal, if you reduce the number of things you have in a pot, the uncertainty should grow because you have this portfolio effect, which is the diversification actually reduces uncertainty. But the fact is that the decrease in uncertainty you get from stage to stage is so much greater than the decrease in uncertainty that comes from the portfolio effect that your uncertainty is reducing as you're going through. Now, in theory, the means, the middle of these distributions, should stay more or less the same. But that only works if you're absolutely honest about all of the uncertainties that you're getting there at the start. And this generates quite an interesting tension in the sense that if you put all those uncertainties there, things like, can we do this responsibly? Can we afford to take the necessary safety and environmental steps that we need to take? If you get all of those in early, then what we'll find is that things that eventually get sort of pressured out of the system for various reasons as they go along, they don't mean that much because you've already taken account of it in your risking. The reality was that people didn't do that. They just everything they possibly could in here because they wanted to show that they had a good pipeline. And then what you have as far as your investor concerned is you have companies that have a reputation for losing a lot of reserves. So they have a lot in their resources, but everybody knows that yes, they're reporting a lot of prospective resources, but everybody knows that because they're not risking heavily enough, those things will disappear very quickly. On the other hand, you had companies who were very honest about it. They were maybe not quite so it wasn't looking quite so healthy from a prospective resources point of view. But because it was understood that they were doing this and they were risking it heavily, and they were publishing this in the way that they were doing the reserves reporting, and people would know that they could expect to see quite a lot of that transitioning through to the final reserve assets. That's a very quick overview of what is a very elegant, slightly sophisticated system. What I wanted to do is maybe open up in question and answers to hear, and then if there are any questions about the sort of reality of this thing and how it works in practice. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Graeme. That was fantastic. And again, the virtual muted round of applause, I'm sure, is raining out across the world at the moment. So I think this was a fascinating insight into, okay, what is the world of oil and gas, where you often find mining and oil and gas, despite the fact that many of us who work in these different sectors started off doing the same kind of undergraduate degrees and then went in different directions. And now we speak almost totally different languages in a way, yet there's so much we can learn from one another. And something that struck me was one thing you said towards the end there, which was you don't want to be a company that gains a reputation to lose reserves. So you used to have this big fat pipeline at the front end, or it's more like a kind of a cone where you're losing all of those reserves. Within oil and gas, do you tend to find that it's the same company that owns that asset or has the rights to the asset all the way through that, the discovery through to actually operating the asset, or do you find that you have exploration companies that then sell the assets, so you get a more broken up value chain? And the reason I ask is that in mining you have quite a broken value chain, and so therefore you don't necessarily see companies who appear to lose their reserves. But I just wondered what the comparison was to oil and gas.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. For a long time, oil and gas were, we talk about E&P, we talk about exploration and production, and we talk about exploration production companies, and we did that until at least 2012, 13, 14. So yeah, traditionally oil and gas were cradle to grave, and companies prided themselves on that. I think towards, here I am talking about the demise of oil and gas. Towards the end, I'm already writing about the sunset of the oil and gas industry. Towards the end, you saw a lot more diversification. So you saw companies that would sort of specialize in exploration and who would make discoveries and then sell them on. Sort of end-of-life assets. Companies who specialize in the sort of assets that were just about to be decommissioned, and they were sort of trying to make those things work. So you saw more specialization. It came late, and actually, I think in a sense, it's a nice idea. You kind of think, yeah, let's specialize in this thing, let's build up that capability. But I think there were two realities in the oil industry that made it a problem. One was that oil companies don't own the technology anymore. It's the oilfield service companies that have owned technologies, and they have done since 2000. I think one of the problems with the oil industry and one of its inabilities to react is that they persuaded themselves that they still own their technologies, but it was only in very rare cases that they actually did. And the other problem is that if you're specialized on one particular stage of the life cycle, then you don't have that diversification that's necessary to be able to take oil price volatility. But so just come back to your point about the mining oil and gas thing. I think it's very interesting. One of the things that struck me about Tarun talk was the nationalization of these things. So we take it for granted in oil and gas that there's these SPE guidelines. Now they're interpreted quite differently in the States from how they're interpreted in Europe, but it's one set of guidelines, and it's it's an international set of guidelines. So that's a very interesting difference. And I should also say that this might look very different from what I was talking about this morning. But that's also because I have presented it as it was intended and not as it's actually practiced. As it's actually practiced, I think there's a lot more similarity. So what actually happened, and what you see a lot, is that these what should be articulations of the uncertainty range that are there actually turn out to be mapped to certain stages in the development of an asset. So for example, what you'll see very often is that, there's difference from 2C to 1C. That's a question of, have you actually managed to penetrate the block that the oil is supposed to be in? So it's actually got nothing to do with the uncertainty range. It's got more to do with the actual events that take place. So there's much more sort of a mapping between event and these categories. And that reminds me a lot of the slide that Teresa was showing this morning with the reserves and the resources and what was it, inferred, implied, and whatever it was, I can't quite remember, but those things. And actually, to be honest, I think the practice of these things is possibly more meshed than you get the impression looking at this, which is a little bit of a sort of holy grail, how it ought to be, rather than how it is in reality.